Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and it's been quiet, so I thought it might be fun to take a little trip into my very messy studio to share a little bit of casting. I've been working on perfecting how I cast my doll Tall in preparation for offering him as a ready-made doll head, and part of that is switching to a slower curing resin. So I'll need to do some experimenting. This will be a very informal, behind-the-scenes video, just sharing some of what the process is like. Over the past little while, I've also started a little collection of questions people have asked about my dolls in general, and my writing, so I'll take the time to answer those too. Here I've got my molds ready, prepared with mold release and rubber banded shut. I'm going from using Alumilite white resin, which cures super fast, to using Smooth Cast 305. This has a longer working time and a slower curing time, which means it's less likely to trap bubbles in the mold. There is a trade-off though, and that's that slower cure times mean the dye is more prone to marbling. The latter is a common issue in dolls though, and between the two problems, I'd rather have marbling than bubbles. I prepare all my tools first, including my silicone cups for resin mixing, pipettes for measuring dye, and a scale for making sure my resin is perfectly mixed. I originally had intended to share this footage in real time, but it ended up being more than an hour long, so I sped up some of the slower parts. The reason I measure my resin really precisely with a scale is because it lets me guarantee my dye ratios are the same between castings. So if I have a head cap that doesn't turn out, I'll be able to mix a new pour that will still match it even though they weren't made at the same time. The blue mold I have is my current working mold, which is perfect, and the pink one is the first mold I made, which had a flaw on the doll's chin. Since I'm using a new resin, I figured I'd go ahead and use both the perfect and flawed molds because it's possible the new resin will take sanding well enough that I can correct the flaws with finishing work, preventing me from wasting all that silicone. If it doesn't work out, I'll just cut up the mold pieces and use them as filler in a future mold. So measuring and mixing is pretty boring, which makes it a good time to answer questions, and the first one on the list is, how do you start modding dolls when you're worried you'll mess them up? Honestly, it's just kind of a leap of faith. Very few things you can do to a doll are unfixable. Every extensive modification I've ever done can be undone with either epoxy or a drill, so there's no way to ruin a doll. Even shattered resin can be repaired, which is something I'll actually be sharing soon as someone sent a broken doll head to me for repair. But I think it's important to go into modifications knowing that they won't always work out perfectly. You'll have stuff go wrong, you'll have frustrations, you'll have things that don't turn out the way you wanted, and that's okay. That's an important part of the learning process. So the best way to get over the fear is just to jump in and take comfort in knowing that even if you don't have the skill to fix everything that goes wrong yet, you will, so nothing is ever ruined forever. The next question was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? To which the only appropriate answer is celebrating the 5th year anniversary of you asking me that question. In all seriousness though, I do keep a 5-year plan in my planners, but it's just kind of a guideline of what I hope to achieve, and some of those milestones are outside of my control. I'd love to picture myself making a lot of recovery in my health, but I can't guarantee that'll happen even if I do everything right. Similarly, while I have a lot of goals for writing books and things, it's really more of a dream big kind of thing than anything else because I can never predict how that field will change or how much my health will actually allow me to do. Ideally though, I'd like to finish my series Spectrum Legacy in the next couple years, and I'm not counting on anything bigger than that. Next is, where do you start if you like these dolls? And I think the most robust resource is still the Den of Angels forum. It can be a little hard to navigate, but their wiki is probably the biggest, and a lot of beginner guides have been put together to help people figure out where to start. Otherwise, I'd suggest you begin window shopping for dolls on a reputable dealer's website, like Alice's Collections or Denver Doll Emporium. That way, you can start getting a feel for what you like and figure out how much things are going to cost. Starting in the hobby is a really broad subject, so it's hard to answer simply, but if anyone wants to see kind of a BJD starter guide video, I'd be happy to make one. Just let me know in the comments. At this point in the doll making process, I've shaken up my dyes and I'm measuring them into part of my unmixed resin. My hand got in the way here. I didn't have a great place to put my tripod and I needed my overhead mount out of the way to be able to move molds easily, but I'm still experimenting with dye ratios to get the look I want. I've figured out a good tan and a good light skin tone for the resin I've been using, so I'll stick with that for now. Even though the dye comes in a squeeze bottle, it's very hard to control the flow with them, so I use a pipette to measure out my dyes. I'll cast the tan in the blue mold and the light one in the pink mold, so I stir everything up and then pour them in. Unfortunately, the footage for me putting the molds into my pressure pot just didn't record, so we just jump to the part where I'm getting the molds back out after everything is cured. The resin claims to have a 30-minute cure time, but I want the pieces to be completely cool before I remove them from the molds, otherwise they may warp. So I let them sit for well over an hour. The first thing I noticed was that the colors seemed way off. This apparently requires a lot more dye than the Alumilite resin, possibly because I'm using Alumilite dyes, so now I'm working across companies and will have unpredictable results. I ended up with some bubbles in the lighter colored head, but there was dust and dirt in the mold, so he's not what I would consider a sellable head anyway. He'll be perfect for experimenting with sanding though, to see if the pink mold is usable for lighter resins. He's just nowhere near the color he was supposed to be, so I'll have to work out something else for my dye ratios. The tan too turned out way lighter than it should have. This is closer to the resin I previously mixed that was really similar to Mayudal Coffee Brown, which is sort of halfway between their normal pink resin and their tan. It's a nice color, but not at all what I was going for. So this is going to end up being a one-of-a-kind B-grade doll head. The gray thing I take off the blue mold is a mold frame I made with my 3D printer. It let me pour the mold and also holds it firmly together without letting it be warped by the pressure of rubber bands. It's my new favorite way to make molds, so all my future molds will be made that way too. I never pull very hard when removing pieces from my molds. I like to slowly wiggle them free instead. It looks like this guy has a rough spot on his cheek, which is frustrating, because that's a sign of the mold deteriorating. A good mold should give at least 10 high-quality casts before it starts to wear out, and this guy is only the 5th cast from this mold, so that's super discouraging. I could understand wear around places like the ears, which are more detailed, or inside the head, since the mold core is difficult to remove, but someplace smooth like the cheek, where it's been properly coated with mold release, shouldn't deteriorate so quickly. So unfortunately, it looks like I'll be making another new mold for this guy soon. I've been generally dissatisfied with this Platinum Cure silicone, so I think I'll be switching back to the pink Tin Cure. It's a high-strength silicone, so it should hold up just fine to heavy-duty casting. Here I'm comparing the old resin's tan to the new one. These have the same amount of dye in them, but the Alumilite resin is a much richer color. I'd estimate I probably need about 50% more dye to reach that shade, so I'm going to mix a new batch with that dye ratio and see what happens. A few hours later, the second tan pour is done. Unfortunately, the head cap mold warped a bit while casting, so the head cap ended up having a weird lump on the top. I wasn't too happy about that. I also noticed a dark spot on the top where this mold is now deteriorating too, leaving flecks of silicone in the resin. This really should have held up better than it did. The pink mold for the neck disc is holding up great, so I'm pretty sure it will meet my needs fine when I remake the molds. The new pour of tan looks great compared to the old resin, so my guess of 50% more dye was almost exactly what it needed. Maybe one drop more would make it a perfect match. I'm really happy with that, but my later experiments with the lighter skin tone didn't go so well. He turned bright pink instead of what he should have been, so I'll have to come up with an all-new color formula for my lighter skin tones. On the whole though, these casts have turned out pretty well. Mold deterioration aside, the new resin has eliminated a lot of the problems I had with trapped bubbles around the magnet wells and eyes, so the next step for these casts is going to be trimming tabs and flash and sanding them nicely. I'll need funds for new silicone before I can get perfect casts, and I gotta pay for that somehow, so offering a few of these not quite right colors at a lower cost will help finance it. I trim off the poor tabs I can, and if I feel too much resistance, I don't cut the tabs with clippers because they're more prone to breakage in bad ways. A lot of the tab and sprue removal is done with a Dremel, which I didn't record because it was just too messy and also hard to see inside my sanding box. But the Dremel only gets me so far. Most of my finishing work happens by hand, so that's what I move on to next. I use an assortment of different files, blades, and differing grits of sandpapers to smooth out the resin after casting. It takes a while. Each doll head takes me around an hour to completely finish by hand. So even sped up, that's plenty of time to answer the rest of the questions I had piled up. One of those questions was, which is my favorite doll company? And I don't know, am I allowed to say me? Myself? Am I a doll company now? I guess I'm just a small solo artist, so I have to pick someone else, so I'd probably say Apple House. I really enjoy their aesthetic, and Tall's larger neck opening is made to fit on their SID body, which he happens to look pretty good on. Another person asked, how do you enjoy the hobby when you're not crafty? I know my channel makes it seem like the craftiness is the biggest part of the hobby, but that's not true for everyone. Some people find joy in photography or just dressing up the dolls. Some like to dress them up once with a perfect wig and eyes and put them in a cabinet as something pretty to look at and not touch. So I guess it depends on what's important to you. There's no wrong way to be in the hobby really, and we all handle our dolls differently. For me, I'm in love with the customization. But I know plenty of people who only buy full set dolls and keep them in cabinets, and they're just as enthusiastic about the hobby as me. It's just about finding what works for you. Then there were a lot of questions about writing, one of which was, what is your inspiration for writing? And I think my inspiration comes from a lot of different places, but a couple big ones are video games that either have a strong sense of immersiveness or an enjoyable narrative arc. I play a lot of video games, and I think they're probably my biggest inspiration and influence, but another thing that greatly inspires me to write is consuming media like books or games or movies that are just not very good. My husband and I really enjoy dissecting the reasons why a story isn't working for us, and figuring out what makes a story bad can really help inspire ideas that make a story good. It's also really motivating to read or watch several things in a row that are just bad, because then I'm compelled to write something much better than that just to ease my frustration, and it makes the creative process easier knowing that it's really hard for me to do worse than those movies I just watched. After that was the question, what's the next story about? I'm not really sure how to answer that because the book I'm working on right now is Paragon of Light, the fourth book in Spectrum Legacy, which is a traditional epic fantasy, and since it's the fourth book in the series, I can't say much about it without huge series spoilers. But that's also kind of an ongoing story, so I don't know if it counts as the next story, because it's not the one I'm working on next. It's just one story that happens to span several books. I have 3 options for what story I write next, but the one I'm most likely going to tackle is one with dragons because I love them, but weirdly have never written any dragon stories. The next question was, do you have any plans for stories that feature a gay or bi main character? And I'm going to say no because as I've been publishing for a few years, I've noticed that the stories that sell really well for me are those with a heavily romance-oriented plot. I've written stuff that doesn't revolve around romance, like Tall's Heist Adventures, and not a single book in that category has ever earned back its production expenses for me. I do unfortunately need my books to be able to pay for themselves so I can keep writing, so I'm shifting my focus to my heavily romantic stories, and I don't feel like that category of romance is mine to write, especially when the publishing field highly encourages something called own voices for that community. So, because most of my stories are now romances, I stick to my own life experiences, my own voice, which is why so many of my stories involve relationships that are either interracial or intercultural, because that's my everyday life, being in a mixed marriage and raising a child who has a foot in both cultures, both communities. It's a relationship dynamic that has its own problems and nuances that I personally deal with every day and don't often see represented in media. So that's my opportunity to put a piece of my reality out there in the world, so that as she grows, my daughter has the chance to read more stories about families like hers. Lastly was the kind of fun question, what Pokemon are each of your characters? And I have way too many characters to do them all, so I'll just pick a couple of the doll characters. I'll start with Tall, who I think has big Sneasel vibes. It's a long-limbed dark type that's good at climbing and steals, so it seems like a good match to me. Pharrell would definitely be a Chansey because she's a medic and overall responsible and sweet, but she's not going to hesitate to double slap anyone who rubs her the wrong way. Vaughn seems like a Growlithe to me, the fierce but cuddly guard dog type. Not quite dangerous enough to be an Arcanine yet, but getting close. Laylee has always struck me as kind of a Venomoth, maybe because of the alchemical poisons thing, or maybe because I made her that wing cloak, I don't really know. Arios was fun because I asked my husband since I stole the character from him originally, and we went really different directions. I'd say he's a Persian because he's kind of aloof but charismatic, but very fickle too. My husband said Infernape, no explanation. And then Rune, who I feel can really only be Mewtwo, with his background of being a failed experiment with powers he doesn't fully understand, lost and struggling to find purpose in a world that can't seem to explain why he is what he is. I think those are all the questions I have time to answer right now, because it looks like this doll is pretty much done, just needing magnets glued in place. I'll wrap up this one and the rest of the casts I've pulled to see which ones are a good enough quality to offer, and hopefully I'll be able to start posting them soon. And that's all for today though. Thanks for watching. Bye.